Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Breanna LaShell to talk about a young founder or young founders starting nonprofits. Breanna, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for having me.
So my favorite question to start the podcast, the episode, is to ask my guest, what is your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Yeah, so I have a pretty untraditional starting place when it comes to nonprofits. So back when I was a sophomore in high school, I actually helped co-found an organization that we later turned into a nonprofit. So that's kind of where I got started. I was 16 years old, and this project I didn't have a nonprofit in mind, but it quickly grew and turned into something that I was like, for us to be taken seriously, for us to have the reach and the impact that me and my team really wanted to have, a nonprofit just seemed like the best next step. And so that's what we did. And so when I was 19, we were taken under a fiscal sponsor and granted 501c3 nonprofit status. And then I ran that organization for almost 12 years. So yeah, that's kind of how I got started.
Awesome. And 16 is so young to start. That's amazing. And just if you could update us on what you're doing these days.
Yeah, so these days I work really closely with nonprofit founders. I am a nonprofit coach, and I kind of do all of the support that you can't Google. So if you go onto Google right now and you search how to start a nonprofit, you'll get all of the business side. You'll see like, okay, these are the forms you need to fill out. Here's the, 5 steps of things that you need to do. But none of those really give you the depth of what it means to be a founder in regards to running a team, coming up with a good mission and vision, creating strategy and a foundation, creating like legacy documents, exit strategies, bringing on volunteers, what it looks like to take this heart dream and make it really tangible so you can have an impactful organization. And then I get to work a lot with some non-traditional founders like me. A lot of them are younger or maybe people of color or women, and it gives me a really wide range of different personalities that might not always think that they're the quote unquote right fit for a nonprofit founder, but has huge vision, huge impact that they can make with what they want to do. And I can help them mold those ideas into actionable steps.
Awesome. I like the fact that you said you help people with things they cannot Google, because I imagine younger founders will more likely to use Google to help them get started
Yes.
versus older ones, who are like maybe trying other means because they're just not as sophisticated technology wise.
Right. And even just the resources, like the bandwidth as far as like network that younger founders have aren't usually as wide as someone who's older starting an organization. And so sometimes it's a lot harder to find out where to go or who to talk to get some of the information, or even just the clarity that sometimes an older generation is just naturally has because of their age, because of their networking, because of how many different jobs that they might have had beforehand, like the different contact points that they have. So just giving people who might not have those same types of resources, the same type of support, I think is really important. And I really enjoy it.
That's a really good segue actually to my first question, because there are obviously differences being a young founder and an older founder. I mean, it's a gray zone here. We're not trying to define what it means to be each. But let's say there are definitely some differences. I'm seeing it as well too with the people who are younger than I am compared to who I am, and my parents compared to me. So if you could, besides networking, which I think is a really important one that you just mentioned, are there other differences that you've noticed in general? We'll still start high level, between young founders starting nonprofits and older ones starting nonprofits?
Yeah, I think just in general with like a younger generation, there's different, even just different, not heart postures, but different motivations for starting organizations. There's different ways that they want things to feel. So, in my experience working with younger organizations, they have a real desire to be like in their organization in ways that I've never seen before. So I've gotten the opportunity to work with a lot of different nonprofits, either as a founder, on the board, or now as a coach. And just their need to like bring in new technologies to really just get community involvement and like really be in the thick of it has been really interesting to me. Whereas some different type of organizations, of course, mission is their goal, but how they interact with people, how they interact with their communities, seems to be a little bit more of a distance versus like this newer generation who's just like really has their hands in the mud and they're getting really creative with how they interact via like technology, via just how they're communicating with people and how they're getting feedback and putting it back into the organization. I've just in my own research, I've seen, I was reading a study that said about 56% of Americans in this case no longer trust nonprofit organizations. And I think a lot of that is because there's been so much ambiguity. And I really see a desire to kind of erase some of that ambiguity within nonprofits nowadays, especially with this newer wave of nonprofits that are being started. It's just really wanting to bring people in and have that type of individual connection versus this higher level, okay, we're going to make money or we're going to do this thing, we're going to give back to the community, and then it's kind of over with. They want that relationship.
That's interesting. You brought up the 56% of people don't trust nonprofits because my previous guest, the one that I had just on last time, said the exact same stat. So is this a recent measurement?
Yes, that's a recent study that I was doing research on, and I think it's really fascinating because nonprofits within themselves are meant to help support people or causes, right? And so the fact that so many people have this level of distrust in the nonprofit organizations here is really like almost like a light bulb for me that we have to make changes within the nonprofit sector for nonprofits to still be useful, right? Because if people can't trust us, then how can we provide services that are impactful? And so getting creative and finding new ways to re-engage communities and really focus on being impact driven and showing people that we mean what we say and we're truly here to help support them is going to make it where nonprofits has more longevity, I would say.
And with every challenge, of course, there's an opportunity. So I'm happy to see that you're seeing it as one and helping then drive or change the direction. Because I agree. I mean, if nonprofits can't do what they're supposed to do, and like that's a tragedy. I mean, they're such an important part of the community. I can't imagine life without them.
Yeah, I agree. And just even within that same statistic, it's measured that most nonprofits started will end or close its doors or fail within 5 years. So that within itself is a tragedy too, because there's so many good causes and there's so many great opportunities for communities to see real impact. I mean, obviously there's like global organizations, but most nonprofits are relatively small and they're really there to serve their immediate communities. And if they're failing or not growing at the rate that they need to be able to sustain their mission, then it's really local communities that are missing out. And so trying to figure out ways to build more solid foundations for organizations is a really important piece of this.
Circling back then to the younger, so I listed off a couple of things you mentioned. You said that the motivation typically is different for a younger founder. They're more involved. They get more involved in the tech, or they involve tech in their strategy. They're more involved in the community, and their communications are different. I mean, we could talk about each one, but I'm interested in two of them. One of them is motivation, and the one is tech. If we could talk about motivation, you said that, and I got the impression that there's I don't know if it's a deeper motivation or there's a more emotional motivation. How would you describe the motivation of a younger founder?
I would say it's even more personal. So, like, for example, I can use myself. The organization that I helped co-found and I ran was a bullying prevention community building organization. And so when I was younger, I suffered from bullying. It was a horrific experience. Like it was really bad. It really impacted my mental health. And then when I was a sophomore in high school, someone in my community died by suicide due to bullying. And it was really kind of like a wake-up call for me. And it really fueled me in the aspect that I had this idea that I had a story that could help other students like me to provide them with some type of hope and strategy that bullying doesn't last forever and that there's so much more to life and to them outside of, for me specifically, like middle school years. Middle school was the hardest season of bullying for me. And so that really fueled my passion and my desire to build my organization, because I knew what it was like to be a student who was bullied. And it was my mission to make sure that there wasn't more students within my community who suffered the same way or who lost their life due to bullying. And so I think there's really this personal connection that I see when I speak to a lot of founders, especially younger founders, that there's been some type of life event that's happened to them or their family, or there's some type of connection that they have to this cause that burns so deeply inside them that there is no other option but to do something. And then a lot of times that something is to create a nonprofit, to have the impact that they're looking for. And so it's just like this deeply rooted, almost fire, it feels like, when I talk to a lot of them, that I can really relate to, because it mirrors my own experience.
Yeah, it's awful to be bullied. I'm sorry for you, and thank you for sharing that. That must have been it's. I think it's wonderful that you're able to turn that experience, that negative experience, into a positive one and have it amplified and really make a big influence and impact to people around you, and hopefully try to prevent that from happening to others. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah, of course. No, it's just a part of my story, and definitely, like, this new generation, like Gen Z, and especially, they are um activists at heart in a lot of ways. Like, I think we can see that in just any trend, even outside of like the nonprofit realm. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that they connect with the heart of what it means to be a nonprofit, but they can sometimes be like turned off to the traditional, almost corporate-esque vibe that a nonprofit, I think the thought of our head when we think of a nonprofit is much more almost like stuffy and corporate and just like not as welcoming. And so they can get kind of turned off by that idea. And so they're really trying to make the nonprofit sector their own, and they're bringing in this like warmness and this like community relationship aspect that I was talking about earlier into the nonprofit sector. And I think that's really going to be the shift that's going to help impact um, how nonprofits are viewed and how impactful they can actually be in communities, because there is that relationship.
Yeah, I also got the same sense that the younger generation prefers a much more personal, much deeper connection to things, because I think
Yeah,
it's maybe a saturation of technology where you meet people online and you connect online, but that, I think, there's a certain trend, it seems, that is rejecting that at a certain point, to say,
yeah,
there's a trend to go back to flip phones, for example, dumb phones, because it's an oversaturation. So I think the one of the consequences of that is people want to be more connected at a personal level and in person,
right,
which is
right.
wonderful. So I think that trend seems to continue in the nonprofit space for these younger founders as well.
Yeah, and then the beautiful thing is that they're not totally going away with technology. They're just using it to their benefit in the way that I feel like sometimes the older generation still hasn't adapted to. Since they did grow up with social media and just like the instant click culture, they know how to use it really well because that's all they've ever known. And so bringing even that within to the nonprofit sphere, I think is really helpful, because like traditionally, for most nonprofit organizations, there isn't a huge social media presence. There isn't, they normally don't have beautiful, in-depth websites, unless they're larger organizations. So they know those skills already. A lot of this younger generation can code, or they have design skills, or they've been making websites since they were in elementary school. And so that's just a second nature that they don't have to learn themselves. So it's easier for them to implement it and make those connections with the people that they're wanting to connect with, and then bring it personal or in person.
Let's say you had a young founder or a young person who wants to be a founder, and they come to you, or they're looking for advice. They want to start a nonprofit, but typically they need a bit of direction. Is there anything that you typically, I should say, offer as advice, things to consider, maybe top few, five, three things that are important when this founder or when this person wants to become a founder?
Yeah, so I think like the first thing is you have to take this vision seriously. Like one of the top things that I think is a misconception for people is that nonprofits aren't businesses, but they definitely are. A nonprofit is a business and it needs to be treated as one. And that can be a huge surprise for founders that I work with specifically. But you have to have a plan. You have to take it seriously. There's a lot of legal implications when starting a nonprofit. And so being prepared to take those next steps and be like committed to this process is really important. And then I think the next thing is getting a really good team behind you. Really getting creative with how you use maybe your limited resources. So, for example, if you're a college age younger founder who maybe hasn't been in the workforce very long, um, a good place to start is maybe like your parents and their friends and getting together with those relationships that you already have, maybe with the older generation, to help get really good people behind you who believes in you and your vision and who doesn't want to take over running your organization, but is there to help complement you in the ways that you might not have the expertise, right? Because especially being younger, there are things that we lack, right? Like at 16, I had no idea what it meant to run a business, to run a team, to do all the things that a nonprofit has to do to be successful. But I had a passion, I had a vision, and I had real clarity of where our organization was going. And so when I had that, it was easy for my team to feed off of that and give me direction in the places that I lacked or I wasn't as experienced in. But I was very lucky to have a co-founder who really believed in me and believed in the vision that I had, that he never tried to overrun what I was saying. Where a lot of people told me no, he always told me yes. So finding the people who can like stand behind a young founder and support them and really is bought into the vision of that founder and just wants to support that vision, I think is really, really crucial. And then I think just having almost having like the lack of fear to take the step, because the fact of the matter is when you start any venture, no matter how old you are, there's always a risk of failure, right? There's always the risk of it not working out, but you're never going to know if you don't try. So just preparing yourself as best you can, getting a team together who is going to support you and hold you accountable, and then just taking the next step and not being afraid of hearing the word no. Because as a younger founder, you're probably going to be told no a lot more than someone who's your senior, right? Because there's just some people who cannot get behind a young founder running an organization. And that has nothing to do with the founder itself. That has to do with other people's notions of what it means to be a founder and what a founder should look like. And so not taking those no's personally and having the strength and the drive to keep asking different people or keep going different directions and learning how to pivot and be flexible to get to the desired mission. Because if the mission is worth it to a founder, if the cause means enough and you have a good plan in place, there's no reason why it can't be successful. You just have to find the right people. And sometimes that takes a lot of trial and error and hearing a lot of no's.
The theme that I get from this, from what you said so far at least, is you really need to be sure of your cause. Like it shouldn't be just a whim. It's an important decision based on the fact that it is a business. There are implications of that alone, plus the team, plus maybe getting a co-founder, plus having courage. I mean, there definitely has to be a threshold of this isn't just an idea. This is something I can really get behind, and
Right.
I will persevere regardless of all the little snags that come my way, the challenges. Because of course, I love the expression: success is not an absence of problems; it's an ability to deal with them. So you're going to have problems. It's how do you manage those problems that will get you past all of these challenges. But you need to have that motivation to begin with. And if you don't, then you probably shouldn't start one. Even if you're semi-passionate, it's probably not enough. You probably want to make sure you're very sure, quite sure about what you're trying to achieve, and that will get you past those obstacles.
Yeah, there's definitely a level of commitment that has to be made. And that's some of the very first things. Anytime I work with a new client and founder, we dive deep into their mission, their vision, their founder story, why they connect with this cause, why it matters to them, why they care about the people that they're supporting, to really develop that deep why that's going to continue to fuel them. And then I've had some people that I've worked with that we start doing this work and they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, if you don't know, then this might not be the battle that you want to have, because it's not as simple as just waking up and being like, okay, I'm going to change the world today by raising some money for this cause, and then that's it. There's so much more work and depth that goes into creating a sustainable, impact driven nonprofit organization, that if you don't have the deep rooted commitment, then it's likely that your organization isn't going to thrive and grow the way that you envision it to.
Any other strategies, tips, areas of focus you could mention besides the ones we've spoken out so far?
I think, like, I really have to drive in this point of, just because it's not the norm, just because you might not look like the traditional founder doesn't mean that you're not. Like, I think another statistic that I was reading the other day is that statistically speaking, there are no 20-year-old founders, 20-year-old or younger founders, which, if you look at me, I'm a 20. I was less than 20 years old when I started my organization. So the fact is that there's not a lot of people who are part of the younger generation. I think the average age of nonprofit directors are 40 years or older, and that represents about 89% of all executive directors, right? So there's for younger generation, there's not a lot of examples of what it looks like to be a younger founder. And I think that that can be really put offish for them sometimes. It can be really intimidating to start and do something that you've never seen done before or you don't see a lot of. But I think that's really where the younger generation has an opportunity to kind of shift that narrative. But you have to be willing to take the almost consequences of that. So that could be people not working with you, people maybe not taking your idea as seriously, or maybe it just being harder to get some of the resources that other people have easier access to. But when you form the right team and you're committed to that vision, there is a possibility, and that's where we can start seeing this narrative shift. And not to say there's anything wrong with older executive directors. They bring so much depth and life, and they are running our organizations right now. But I think there's always room for a new perspective. There's always room for new ideas, new ways of doing things. And I think that this younger generation is really the opportunity to take what nonprofits has been and make it even better in partnership with founders that are already working in the sphere right now.
You mentioned at one point the fact that you had a co-founder who was very supportive.
Yeah.
Is that something that you typically would like to see if a young founder is either struggling or doesn't have as much resources to maybe partner with an older person to be able to join forces and bring the best of both worlds, a younger, fresh eyes on things, and yet the resources and the networking capability of the older generation?
Yeah, so personally, that worked really, really well for me. And I mean, obviously, my situation was unique, right? I don't have a lot of founders, even working with the younger generation. I don't have a lot of 16-year-olds coming to me saying they want to start a nonprofit, right? And so, in my instance, it made so much sense for me to partner with my co-founder, and he was very supportive, very ingrained in our community. He had a lot of the connections and resources that I didn't have the ability to have at 16. So for me, it worked really well. My only caution to that is making sure that it's a good pairing, right? So if a younger founder comes to me and they have a partnership in mind that feels really organic and really it makes a lot of sense for them, then I think that's a great way to kind of combat some of the struggles that solo young founders have. But you want to make sure that the person that you bring on as a co-founder is going to complement your, like, his their strengths are going to complement your weaknesses, and that there's an even score, like that y'all are moving the right direction. I guess you would say that there's that no one is trying to overpower the other, that no one is seen as like better or bigger than the other, and that goes both ways, because that creates a failure before it even starts, right? And so if the pairing makes sense and both parties are really bought into the mission and they feel really passionate about it, then I think that that's a great way to collaborate and kind of bridge that gap, but only if it works for both parties.
And I can imagine that if someone can't find that co-founder, that older co-founder, maybe a mentor or a guide, someone to at least offer some kind of support, guidance, even though they're not necessarily directly involved in the day-to-day activities of the
Yeah.
nonprofit, having that mentor for looking for advice, I think that would be a good strategy as well. Would you agree?
Yes. I totally agree. And just I think that we need that as people in general. I think it's important for us to have mentors. It's important for us to have people in our corner that, even if they're not directly involved in our projects and our passions, whether it be a nonprofit or a business or whatever, but them having us having enough respect for those people in our life that they would be able to talk into us and pour into us, and that we would be open to receive feedback, positive or negative, I think is really important, especially as we grow as leaders. I think that's another challenge that young founders can have, is that they haven't had enough time to develop their leadership. And if you're going to be a nonprofit founder and you're going to support a team, you have to be focusing on your leadership. You have to be growing those skills, and a mentor and trusted advisors around you can help point out things to you that you might not see yourself.
Up until now, we've been talking about things that younger founders should take into consideration. I'm always curious about the opposite question. Are there things or areas that they should be wary of? Are there moments of saying, make sure you don't do this or don't do that, that is not just the opposite of what you should be doing, but maybe it has its own theme?
Yeah, I think, and this could pair with some of the things that we were already talking about, but I think one of the biggest pitfalls that I see with young founders is that um, sometimes they lack professionalism and organization, and that can kill their organization. It can kill their progress, right? And I think it's already like an expectation of older generations that young people can be like irresponsible or not take things seriously, or there's also just a different generationally what it means to be professional, what it means to have, like, what it means to be like quote unquote put together, looks and feels very different just in day-to-day life, let alone in a corporate or professional setting. So I always tell my founders, like, don't change who you are, but make sure you're showing up in the best light and putting your best foot forward to not create an even bigger barrier of entry for you, right? So that means like putting on maybe more conservative clothing. It means presenting yourself, like looking and feeling your best. Like you don't have to wear a three-piece suit or or have like I don't know, a briefcase or anything, but you need to show up looking your best, being professional, knowing what it is that you're wanting from people, showing up to meetings prepared, um, just those like things that seem small, like even like when you're going and talking to people, right? Um, it, it's much more likely that somebody is going to be able to support you or point you in the right direction if you show up to a meeting and say, hey, I know you do XYZ, and so I was hoping that you could help me with ABC. Is that something you would be interested in? Versus showing up to a meeting and saying, hi, I'm going to start this nonprofit. I thought you might want to help. Like being specific and prepared, doing your research makes it a lot easier for people to work with you and support you versus when you don't. And that within itself, I have seen to be a challenge sometimes for this generation, because it's just not as much what they're used to. Like things now are a lot more casual. You text people instead of emailing them. You make connections in DMs versus at networking events, and so they're perspective and viewpoint on professionalism can be a little bit laxed. And in the nonprofit world, where you're dealing with people who are used to having, wearing a suit and doing like after hours socials or meeting on the golf course or things like that, that doesn't always mix, and it makes it harder for an older generation to take the younger generation seriously.
That's a really good call out. Yeah, and I think it's important not to change who you are, but you said it perfectly. Your best version of yourself, because you do need to build credibility. You do need to build
Right.
trust. And if you're dressed in cutout jeans and you're not sitting up even properly, or you're very casual about things, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to build that trust and build that credibility with other people, at least in the
Right.
older generations. Hmm.
Right. Right.
Anything else? Anything other that things that the younger generation, I don't know, younger founders, I should say, should keep into consideration? Things to be wary of, be cautious of, not to do.
Um, yeah, I think like within that same vein, another thing, especially I personally work through, is that just because you are professional doesn't mean that you have to allow people to like treat you poorly. I think, especially like me starting out, I had this idea that every opportunity was a good opportunity. And it didn't matter if the people who were working with me like respected me as a founder. It just mattered that they were helping support my organization. And to an extent, yes, you have to be you have to put your organization above yourself. That's another tangent I can get on in a second. But you have to, as a founder, you have to think about the big picture, right? You have to think about um, what what it is that your organization needs above what you as a founder needs. But that does not mean that you should be taken advantage of. I like to say professionalism does not equal complacency. So you can be professional and still hold your ground. Like if you and your team has made a decision, then that's the decision that you could stand on. And not every opportunity and not every person who you want to work in your sphere or work in your organization is going to be the right fit. And it's okay to walk away from things that aren't serving you or aren't serving your organization, as long as you're not making it personal. You can be professional, and there's professional things that don't click, right? There's professional partnerships that don't work out, but don't lean into, well, I don't like this person, so I don't want to work with them, right? You have to have that good balance of leading your team well, standing in integrity, but also knowing when to say yes and knowing when to say no.
It's an important one too. Yeah, self identity, self respect, boundaries, very important. I totally agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And just also remembering, like, as a founder, um, it can be really easy to pour so much of yourself into your organization, right? Like when you're a founder, you are literally dreaming up and creating this organization from scratch. And that's a beautiful thing, right? But as your organization grows and it develops, it becomes not yours anymore. You have to start sharing it with the team. You have to start giving it to the community that you're serving. And a lot of pitfalls that founders can fall into is believing that because you started the organization is yours. And in my experience, the best nonprofits are those that grow and build and are influenced by everyone who interacts with it and not just the one who created it. And so, learning how to separate yourself from your organization, learning how to take not to take things so personally. So, like, for example, when I was starting, like, if my organization did really well, that was like a personal pride that I had. If we had a goal for something that we didn't meet, then that felt like a personal failure. And that could have been really easy for me to get dragged into this idea that my worth and my value was dependent on my organization, and that my organization's worth and value was dependent on me. And that's a really slippery slope that is important, I think, for us not to get into, to recognize that the two things are separate. And even though you're putting a lot of your heart and your aspirations into this thing, that doesn't mean that you are that thing, especially because one day founders have to leave organizations, they have to step down, they have to change their roles. And so making sure that your organization is an entity separate from yourself, and putting processes and just things in place to help support your organization if you do walk away or if things do have to change from the very beginning, I think is really important.
Yeah, I also totally agree. Don't lose yourself and your identity in this whole thing. Keep an arm's distance to a certain extent. Like, you want to obviously be really involved. You need to be the champion and the biggest cheerleader of the organization, but you can't lose yourself either. So, great idea. I was curious that there's also a theme that we've been covering or circling about building this team. So I was curious to know, let's imagine a young founder who doesn't have access, at least, or hasn't gotten enough support from a mentor or a co-founder to build a team through them. What are some ways that this young founder could build a team successfully on their own?
Yeah, I think like this is where you have to get kind of creative, right? And I think it's like a wide range. So especially with like young founders, it's really easy for us to go to the people we know, to like talk to our friends and things like that. And in some instances, that works really well. um, just to have people who are there. I like to teach all of my founders and clients I work with that there are people called your cheerleaders on your team, and they're the people who are just going to show up for you because they love you. They might not necessarily be bought into what you're doing, but they love and they champion you. And so a lot of times those are your friends, those are your parents, those are your grandparents, right? They'll show up and do stuff just because they love you and because you ask them to, which in the beginning, that might be really helpful. But you want to make sure that you're also finding people who are really bought into your mission. So, for example, when we were in the thick of running my organization, we reached out to people who would have some type of connection with bullying. So we talked to, so also a caveat to help make this more sense. My organization was high school student ran. So all of the people who were going in, we went into elementary schools and junior highs and we put on assemblies about bullying prevention. So we talked about what bullying was, what to do if you see bullying, what it means to be a bystander, things like that. That was the main core of our organization. And so all of the students on our team, we would have them ask their parents, like, hey, do you have any bullying stories? Is there anything, like, is this something that's important to you? Like, what's your experience with it? And then from there, we would get, a lot of times we found parents or grandparents who were really tied to this mission, either because their child themselves had been bullied or they had been bullied or whatever the case may be. And they became big parts of our team. And then with them, they brought connections. And so sometimes you have to start talking to the people in your sphere and then ask them to ask the people in their sphere. And that's how you start building this community of people who not only champion you, but champion your vision, because you need both. And with that, I think it's also really important as a founder, when you're bringing in these people that you know and you love, that's a part of your day to day life, of creating really good boundaries and separation, right? So, for example, some of my very best friends was a part of my organization when I was starting, and we had all of our student volunteers sign a code of conduct and sign like a volunteer agreement. And that way, there's this boundary for me. So when we weren't doing Speak Love stuff, we were just friends, we could hang out. But when we were doing Speak Love stuff, if one of their grades slips, or if they weren't going to class, or if they had XYZ that went against our code of conduct, I was able to speak to them and have like a guiding principle of like, hey, we're friends and I love you, but you're also a part of this organization that I'm running and that I'm leading, and you're not meeting these standards that you agreed to. So we have to do XYZ. And it helped make things not feel so personal for me and for them, and helped us to still maintain relationships outside of our organization, which is something that can be a huge struggle, I think, for younger founders, is like putting in good boundaries into place, especially excuse me, especially with people who you do day-to-day life with, right?
That's a lot of great content. Another topic that I was hoping to cover is a theme that is more prevalent in the younger generation. That's kind of ghosting and flaking, where people either just stop responding to you or they quit. I've heard stories about people even being hired for jobs, for example, and then they never show up on day one, or they just quit, that day without any kind of notice. And I was curious to know if you have any strategies or ways of not maybe not avoiding it or planning for it, or how do you manage around around this kind of activity as a young founder?
Yeah, I think so. This is like two parts, right? So let me speak first to founders doing this behavior. And I think that that really plays into professionalism and the idea of if you want people to take you seriously, then you have to take you seriously. And that means living up to your commitment, showing up when you say you're going to, doing what you tell people you're going to do, right? So personally, I would say that if you're a founder who struggles with this, then this is something that you have to get under control before you decide to lead an organization, because there's so many things and so many responsibilities that fall to founders as leaders and as just the executive director running an organization, that those types of behaviors just are not congruent to a successful organization, right? On the other hand, when young founders are working with other young people who demonstrate these habits, I think it's really important to one, be open to a wide range of people who are going to be supporting your organization. So if just because you're a young founder doesn't mean you should only work with young people, right? Like you should have a wide range of age and a scope of depth of experiences and age range, ethnicities, the whole spectrum of people to work with. But from the very beginning, I think it's really important for you to set standards and to have your people agree to those standards, right? So one of the things I work with my clients on is creating like a volunteer code of conduct, or um, having like a board quality wish list, or like or even like a partnership quality wish list, and having those things up front and being very vocal about them, that okay, yes, we would love to have you a part of the team. Here are our expectations, here are our rules and procedures. I need you to agree to this for us to be able to work together, and then holding really firm to whatever the consequences are if those expectations aren't met, right? Or having a process in place to be able to communicate with people if those expectations aren't met. So if you have like, if part of your code of conduct is that you're going to be available to meet monthly for volunteer meetings, and you have someone who, is ghosting or flaking out or not responding or whatever, then having a process in place to like either, give a reminder like, hey, you signed this, I need you. I know life is busy, being empathetic, but also being really firm of like, hey, these are the expectations, here's how you're not meeting them. And then eventually being okay with having to dismiss people who might not be a right fit for your organization for whatever the reason may be. And also just, I think having those expectations and those standards early helps set everyone up for success, because there's the expectation of that this isn't going to be tolerated within this organization. And I think that's really helpful, especially with young founders working with their peers, or people that they know. Sometimes it can be really easy to be like, oh, well, they're my friend in real life and I know what's going on in their life personally or whatever. And to kind of have like a leeway where as a friend, that's probably a great thing to do, but as a leader and as a professional, it might be it might not be something that you can let slide. And so just having that clarity and those boundaries in place for you and for them, I think can be really helpful for young founders to help combat that issue.
It's a nasty issue. I hope one day we get rid of it, eradicate it.
Yes. It's definitely
But it
hard.
is.
And it's just like a different perspective. Like we've been talking about this almost this whole episode. It's just a different in perspective of like this younger generation thinking, like all bets are off. Like in some ways I think younger generation has that quote unquote lack of loyalty that older generations can talk about. And I think there's places where that serves them really well and places that is really damaging both to them and to the organizations that they're a part of. So just having to figure out what that balance looks like and putting things in place that help support leaders of organizations and people who are trying to come in and support organizations, I think is important.
That's great advice. Looking to the future, is there anything that you can mention, comment on about where you see trends in terms of younger founders starting nonprofits or younger generation in general that you could just share with the audience?
Yeah, I feel like the nonprofit realm is almost on this cusp of things shifting, right? Like we were talking earlier about that statistic of 56% of Americans not trusting in nonprofits. I've been talking about, founders not feeling really connected to the nonprofit sphere and how it's currently run. And so I feel like it can go one of two ways, right? Nonprofits themselves can either die out, which I think would be really devastating in multiple different ways because nonprofits serve communities and just our nation in so many direct ways that them disappearing would be devastating to a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. Or we're going to see this kind of shift in how nonprofits ran, how nonprofits are created, who's creating nonprofit organizations, how they're encased in the community, how communities interact with nonprofits. And that's what I'm really excited for. What I'm really leaning into is what I'm hoping is going to happen is that more and more people will start putting down their notions that, nonprofits are only for, this elite type of saintly person, that founders can look like everyday people. They can look like 16-year-olds who are fed up with bullying. They can look like, moms who are enraged with, the maternal health care in America. They can look like or people who've maybe made poor decisions in their past who want to see other people not make the same mistakes as them. They can look like a wide range of peoples and communities, and how we interact with nonprofits can be really intimate and personal and life-changing on the ground. And I think that's really going to change the trajectory of what it means to be a nonprofit founder and what it means to be a nonprofit around the world. And I think that that's really exciting. There's so many opportunities if founders and people are willing to start thinking outside of the box and really lean into the unknown, because it's never really looked like this before, but that doesn't mean that it can't look like this. And I think that that's a really exciting opportunity for all of us.
Awesome. There's been so much fantastic knowledge here. I learned so much. Thank you so much, Breanna, for joining me. How can people get in touch with you if they have some follow-up questions? Either they're maybe a young founder or a person who wants to be a young founder has questions or has already started, or an older generation looking for insight toward the younger generation. How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I love to connect. You can find me over on Instagram. It's coach_Breanna LaShell, or you can find me on my website, www.breannalashell.com. I'm really responsive. You can also email me at Breanna@breannalashell.com. I'm sure all of those links and stuff will be in the show notes, but please reach out. I love getting to talk to people. I love getting to support different founders or different people who think that they might want to be a founder. And like I said, I work with a lot of clients to really do that ground heart work of an organization. So that way that your nonprofit can have the legacy building perspective and legacy building take that we're kind of looking for to really help build communities and just change the trajectory of what it means to be a nonprofit. So I love getting to connect with new people and chat all things nonprofit, especially if you're a young adult. I'm happy to share some of my other stories of being a 16-year-old founder. That was a wild ride. So I'd love to connect with you. And thank you so much, Alex, for having me on today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope it's helpful for all of your listeners.
Breanna, thank you so much for joining me today.
Woo!
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.